Okay, we're going to visit this idea of vicarious atonement in view of the death of King David's son. Um, Also, all together wrapped up in one package, Ezekiel 18. One man shall no longer die for another man's sins. There's still so many claims out there that even though maybe this wasn't atonement, the baby still died for the sins of King David. And that somehow needs to be rectified with the Hebrew scriptures and by whatever means necessary. Um, um, yeah, I could go on and on, but really I'm just going to keep running circles, saying the same thing over and over again. So if you would, I will probably insert if you say something that reminds me of something that will help you, I'll definitely jump in there and tell you what's on my mind. Okay.
That's a great question. I just want to explain for those who are not familiar with where we're now looking at what's coming into view is the most epic event in King David's life. And I think what makes King David so attractive, because King David had made mistakes in his life, serious mistakes in his life. And he discusses it extensively in the book of Psalms. But the key event is a sin that King David committed. Now, our sages explain exactly the nature of the sin. It's not exactly as it, but the key is King David sinned. That's very critical. And Nathan, the prophet, confronted him, but in a very strange way. He told him a parable, a story, but King David, at the time as hearing this parable, thought it was a real story. This is one of the very interesting use of parable, in that the person listening was King David. Now, this is a private conversation where Nathan comes into David after David had taken Bathsheba for a wife. She was a woman who was married to Uriah the Hittite. It's really a devastating event that occurred. It's for most people who don't read it, don't realize how catastrophic it all was. It was really tremendous tragedy. And God, the anger of God was kindled against King David. The Bible says so. And Nathan came in and told him, he said, in your kingdom there's a rich man and a poor man. The rich man had a great herd of many, and the poor man had only one sheep that it loved and that he took care of and even was in his bed with him. There's an illusion there. And King David's listening to the story that this man had one little, one animal. He loved it, took care of it. One day the rich man had a guest at his home, and instead of taking one of his many animals, he took the poor man's animal and he slaughtered it, he killed it. Now this is very clear when you're listening to the story that this beautiful animal was not just he only had one piece of livestock. But what is being conveyed here is that this was his only sheep. This was the only one. So, and it was like his beloved. It was like his friend. It was like that's all he had. And when King David hears this, he believes he's hearing a real story, but it really was a parable. And King David rises up and he says, "This person shall surely be put to death who did such a terrible thing." And Nathan confronted King David and he said to him, "You are that man." And King David hears that, and this is what makes King David very, very special. He says two words to him, two words. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13. And these two words are what makes King David so unique. He says, "Chatasi LaHashem," I sinned before the Lord. Two words. Nathan saw his heart. He knew that his heart was whole, was pure, that his repentance was genuine. And Nathan said, "The Lord has already put away your sin, has already forgiven you. You won't die." So King David is forgiven for a sin through confession, which in Christian theology should be impossible. At this point, King David is forgiven. But there already is a child that has been born. And there's a problem. King David's sin is forgiven. This we know in verse 13. But this was a private conversation. Who was in the room? Two people, Nathan and David. Nathan conveys over his word of anger and rage, conveying the rage of God. King David apprehends what he's done. He doesn't behave like Shaul, his predecessor, in making excuses. And this is very often the mistake people make, is they just don't know how to say I'm sorry and just stop. Not giving all kinds of, he just says, Chatasi Lashem, I sinned before the Lord. There was a problem. This was a public event, meaning eventually King David tried to cover up what happened, but ultimately everybody else who's not in the room, not in this deeply personal conversation, they have no idea of what happened. As far as they're concerned, if nothing would have occurred, they would just know that there's this massive scandal where the king has a baby with another man's wife. That's all they knew. And if he's forgiven and nothing happens, then it's going to nourish and ignite the enemies of God to curse God. And therefore, the child that King David had with Bathsheba had to die. And what I'm saying to you is not my take on it. It's exactly what the next passage says. That if you go to 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 14, it's exactly what it says. So the death of this child had nothing to do with an atonement. But rather, it was that there shouldn't be a Chil Hashem. There shouldn't be a public desecration of God's name. And in fact, we see this happens. We see that it's not much further on that we are having people cursing David, cursing God. David's on the run. So actually, this all, Shimon ben Gera, all this follows. Now, you might ask, what did this child do? I'm going to say something, but there is a postulate. There's something here that's absolutely axiomatic that must be said. That is that when any child dies, God forbid, it cannot be because of the behavior or act of their child. When any child dies, why? Because, God forbid, if a child dies, no matter what the circumstance is, a child doesn't have the intellectual moral requisite to make real choices. They do not have the moral precepts of the mind. Their frontal lobe is just totally undeveloped. And therefore, until a child reaches, for a girl 12, for a boy 13, what happens to a child, God forbid, has nothing to do with that child. That child is not an independent agent. That child cannot be righteous. Now, you can have a 5-year-old who might say, please, mommy, but he's learning to say that. He's doing it because he's being told eventually he's going to get it and bring it all together and realize altruism, you have to share with your sister, don't beat up your sister, and so on. But children don't have the moral requisite understand. They don't have their minds are not developed. They can't make moral choices. And they can't make moral choices for the good or for the bad. Therefore, when any child dies, and this is axiomatic, although it may be challenging to struggle with, but it's very clear that God has another plan for that child and why that child died. Now, we don't know, in this case, we do know what happened. But children are not free agents. In Jewish tradition, a soul of a child that dies comes back again. But that's beyond the scope of this broadcast. But the key point is it's clear that when a child dies, there's another reason for it, but it cannot be related to the behavior of a child. Why? Because it's axiomatic that a child can't be righteous, can't be wicked. A child could behave in a way that would appear very selfish, would appear sinful, but because they don't have the requisite maturity to make these choices, they're not held accountable for it. So therefore, children are not independent agents, and therefore, when an infant dies, it certainly has nothing to do with that infant, and that's the key point. So that infant does not die as an atonement for anyone's sins. This would be the greatest sin, is to engage an infant in child sacrifice. That's not happening here at all. But what happens is, according to God's plan and for His purpose, this child had to die. And they had to die, what Scripture tells us, is not to atone for any sin, but to send a signal out to his nation. David was not a private person. He didn't have a private life. He was the king of the children of Israel. They had no clue what was going on in this private conversation, but they knew all about this unspeakable scandal. And therefore, this had to happen so that people watching this, if this tragedy didn't occur, if this child didn't die, it would lead people to sin. People would be robbed of their free will. Because if you were watching a king who did what King David did, and nothing happens to him, and he goes on and he's fine, and Nathan just walks out of there, and you're not privy to this private conversation. They didn't have the book of Samuel yet. So what would happen? It would lead people astray. So it was vital that people would have free will. And those who later on rebelled against God because of this, they were in fact enemies of God. And that's actually the language that's used there. So what's very important is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, according to His wisdom and for His purpose, this child had to die. And we see, in fact, in verse 18, we see, in fact, what happens is that King David, when he hears this, he hopes that in some way he might intervene through fasting, and he was laying on the floor and he just fasted and cried and pleaded, but that had to happen. And you see something very striking, and that is when he is informed by his servants that the baby died after 7 days, he right away got up, he changed his clothing, he anointed himself, and they were really surprised. And he said, look, up until that point, and I'm paraphrasing here, I was hoping that maybe there was something I could do to prevent that. But the moment the baby died, I can't bring that baby back anymore. That means God's plan was that that infant died so that that the enemies of God would not curse God. Once the baby died, then King David then his life, he turns his life around and he moves on with his life. But the key point is King David is forgiven. The death of that infant was so that people would not curse God. Because if, when we're dealing with a very difficult passage, it is sometimes useful to ask the what if question. What if the baby hadn't died? Now Bathsheba was Uriah's wife. She has now a baby with King David. What will and they just go on with their lives. What would people do? People would say, this is completely corrupt. The whole prophets are corrupt. Well, how is Nathan having dinner with him when King David did such a thing publicly? So you have a public sin, a private atonement. But if the people did not see something, that the sword came out of his house, that there was fury from heaven, they would have been led to become enemies of God. So that's why that child died. But it is clear, it's axiomatic that no child dies because of their own behavior. Rather, children always die because of a plan that we can't explain unless we have the Bible tell us. No one should ever take this and apply it and say, why did this happen to my brother or my sister? That's not your business to do that. But here we're told very explicitly by the prophet that this is why the child had to die, lest it would give the enemies of God an opening to curse God, and that couldn't be. But children and infants clearly cannot be dying because of their own behavior. So they are, when they die, God watches over their soul, and then they're in the hands of God. But one thing is certain, and that is no baby dies because of his or her behavior. So therefore, no child is an independent agent until they reach the age of maturity, where for a boy it's 13, for a girl it's 12, and then they're held accountable for their own behavior, and then they're independent agents. And what happens to them then is between them and God. But prior to that, they are playing a role that is not related to them.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא עובר והוא יהיה בתפארה